Hello, and welcome to Saturday Night Stories, scary stories for adults and brave teens. My name is Michelle from the Public Library of Youngstown in Mahoning County, and tonight our selection is The Canterville Ghost, adapted from Oscar Wilde. When Mr. Hiram B. Otis of the American Consulate bought Canterville Chase, everyone told him he was doing a very foolish thing, as there was no doubt at all that the place was haunted. Canterville himself had felt it his duty to mention the fact to Mr. Otis when they came to discuss terms. "We have not cared to live in the place ourselves," said Lord Canterville, "since my great-aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Bolton, was frightened into a fit, from which she never really fully recovered, by 2 skeleton hands being placed on her shoulders as she was dressing for dinner, and I feel bound to tell you none of the younger servants would stay with us in consequence of the mysterious noises." "My lord," answered the consul, "I will take the furniture and the ghost as a package deal. I admire the craftsmanship of the former, and very much doubt the existence of the latter." "I fear the ghost exists," said Lord Canterville. "It has been well known for 3 centuries, and always makes its appearance before the death of any member of our family." "Well, so does the family doctor, for that matter, Lord Canterville, but there is no such thing, sir, as a ghost." "You Americans are certainly very pragmatic," answered Lord Canterville. "Only you must remember, I warned you." A few weeks after this, the purchase was completed, and the consul and his family moved into Canterville Chase. Mrs. Otis, who had been a celebrated New York belle, was now an attractive, middle-aged woman with fine eyes and a superb profile. Her eldest son, Washington, was a fair-haired, rather good-looking young man who was well known on both sides of the Atlantic for being an excellent dancer. Miss Virginia E. Otis was a little girl of 15, lithe and lovely as a fawn. She was a great horsewoman. After Virginia came the twins, with a tendency to cause a considerable amount of mischief. As Canterville Chase is 7 miles from the nearest railway station, Mr. Otis had telegraphed ahead for a carriage to meet them, and they started on their drive in high spirits. It was a lovely July evening. As they entered the avenue of Canterville Chase, however, the sky became suddenly overcast with clouds. A great flight of crows passed silently over their heads, and before they reached the house, some big drops of rain had fallen. Mrs. Umley, the old housekeeper, was there to greet them, as they alighted from the carriage, saying in a quaint, old-fashioned manner, "I bid you welcome to Canterville Chase." Following her, they passed through the fine Tudor hall into the library. Here they found a meal had been laid for them, and after taking off their wraps, they sat and began to look around, while Mrs. Umley waited on them. Suddenly, Mrs. Otis caught sight of a dull red stain on the floor by the fireplace, and quite unconscious of what it signified, said to Mrs. Umley, "I'm afraid something has been spilt there." "Yes, madame," replied the old housekeeper in a low voice. "Blood has been spilt on that spot." "How horrid!" cried Mrs. Otis. "I don't care at all for blood stains in a sitting room. It must be removed at once." The old woman smiled and answered in the same low, mysterious voice, "It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her own husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon survived her, but disappeared under very mysterious circumstances. His guilty spirit haunts the chase. The bloodstain cannot be removed." "Nonsense!" cried Washington Otis. "Pinkerton's champion stain remover will clean it up in no time." And before the terrified housekeeper could interfere, he had fallen upon his knees and was rapidly scouring the floor. In a few moments, no trace of the bloodstain could be seen. "I knew Pinkerton's would do it!" he exclaimed triumphantly. But no sooner had he said these words than a fearful clap of thunder made them all start to their feet, and Mrs. Umley fainted. In a few minutes the old woman came to, and, visibly upset, sternly warned Mr. Otis to beware of trouble coming to the house. "I have seen things with my own eyes, sir," she said, "that would make any Christian's hair stand on end." Mr. Otis and his wife, however, warmly assured the honest soul that they were not afraid of ghosts. The storm raged fiercely all night, but nothing of particular note occurred. The next morning, however, when they came down to breakfast, they found the terrible stain of blood once again on the floor. Washington, accordingly, rubbed out the spot with his stick of Pinkerton's, but on the second morning it appeared again. The third morning it was also there, though the library had been locked up at night by Mr. Otis himself, and the key carried upstairs. If anyone was still skeptical, all doubts about the objective reality of phantasmata were dispelled that night, for some time after midnight Mr. Otis was wakened by a curious noise in the corridor outside his room. It sounded like the clank of metal. He got up at once, struck a match, and looked at the time. The strange noise continued, and with it he heard distinctly the sound of footsteps. He put on his slippers, took a small phial out of the night table, and opened the door. Right in front of him he saw, in the wan moonlight, an old man of terrible aspect. His eyes were as red as burning coals. Long gray hair fell over his shoulders in matted coils. His garments, which were of antique cut, were soiled and ragged, and from his wrists and ankles hung heavy, rusted iron manacles. "My dear sir," said Mr. Otis, "I really must insist on your oiling those chains, and have brought for you the purpose a small bottle of the Tammany Rising Sun lubricator. I shall leave it here for you by the bedroom candles, and will be happy to supply you with more, should you require it." With these words, the United States consul laid the bottle down on the marble table, and, closing the door, retired to rest. For a moment, the Canterville ghost stood quite motionless in natural indignation. Then, dashing the bottle violently on the polished floor, he fled down the corridor, uttering hollow groans and emitting a ghastly green light. Just, however, as he reached the top of the great oak staircase, a door was flung open, two little white-robed figures appeared, and a large pillow whizzed past his head. There was evidently no time to be lost, so hastily adopting the fourth dimension of space as a means of escape, he vanished through the wainscoting, and the house became quiet. On reaching a small secret chamber in the west wing, he leaned up against a moonbeam to recover his breath, and began to try and realize his position. Never, in a brilliant and uninterrupted career of 300 years, had he been so grossly insulted. He thought of the Dowager Duchess, whom he had frightened into a fit as she stood before the mirror in her lace and diamonds, and of the 4 housemaids who had gone off in hysterics when he merely grinned at them through the curtains of their bedroom. All his great achievements came back to him again, With the enthusiasm of a true artist, he went over his most celebrated performances and smiled bitterly to himself. After all this, some wretched modern Americans were to come and offer the Rising Sun lubricator and throw pillows at his head? It was quite unbearable. He determined to have his vengeance. A fortnight later, the ghost resolved to make another attempt to frighten these loathsome Americans, and accordingly dressed himself as his celebrated character Reckless Rupert, or the Headless Earl. When all was ready to his satisfaction, at 1:15, he glided out of the wainscoting and crept down the corridor. On reaching the room occupied by the twins, he found the door ajar. Wishing to make an effective entrance, he flung it wide open when a heavy jug of water fell right down on him, wetting him to the skin and just missing his left shoulder by a couple of inches. At the same moment, he heard stifled shrieks of laughter coming from the four-poster bed. The shock to his nervous system was so great that he fled back to his room fast as he could go, and the next day he was laid up with a severe cold. After this debacle, the ghost was so dispirited, as it were, that he gave up trying to frighten the consul and his family, and as the weeks went by, he was all but a forgotten presence in the chase. One afternoon, Virginia was taking a short-cut in the mansion on her way to the stables. She passed the rarely used tapestry chamber, and seeing the door open, looked in to see who might be there. To her immense surprise, it was the Canterville ghost himself. He was sitting by the window, watching, the red leaves dancing madly down the long avenue. His head was leaning on his hand, and his whole attitude was one of deep depression. Little Virginia was filled with pity, and resolved to try and comfort him. "I am sorry for you," she said, "but my brothers are going back to school tomorrow, and if you behave yourself, no one will bother you."
"It is absurd to ask me to behave myself," he answered, looking around at the pretty girl who had ventured to address him. "I must rattle my chains and groan through keyholes and walk around at night. It is my only reason for existing."
"It is no reason at all for existing, and you know you've been very wicked. Mrs. Umley told us the first day we arrived that you had killed your wife."
"Well, I quite admit it," said the ghost petulantly. "But it was purely a family matter, and concerned no one else."
"It is very wrong to kill someone," said Virginia.
"Well, that's over and done with," replied the ghost. "And now I'm so lonely and so unhappy that I really don't know what to do. I wish I could just go to sleep, but I can't."
"That's quite absurd. You merely have to go to bed and blow out the candle. Why, even babies know how to do it."
"I have not slept for 300 years, and I am so tired."
Virginia grew quite grave, and her little lips trembled like rose leaves. She came toward him, and kneeling down at his side, looked up into his weathered old face. "Poor, poor ghost," she murmured. "Have you no place where you can sleep?"
"Far away, beyond the pine woods," he answered, in a low and dreamy voice. "There is a little garden. There the grass grows long and deep. There the nightingale sings all night, and the cold crystal moon looks down over the sleepers." Virginia's eyes grew dim with tears. "You mean the Garden of Death?" she whispered.
Yes, death. Death must be so beautiful. To have no yesterday and no tomorrow. To forget time, to forgive life, to be at peace. You can help me. You can open for me the portals of death's house. For love is always with you, and love is stronger than death is.
Virginia trembled. A cold shudder ran through her, and for a few moments there was silence. Then the ghost spoke again.
"Have you ever read the old prophecy on the library window?"
"Oh, often," cried the little girl, looking up. "I know it quite well. It is painted in curious black letters, and it is difficult to read. There are only 6 lines. When a golden girl can win prayer from out the lips of sin, when the barren almond bears, and a little child gives away its tears, then all the house shall be still, and peace come to Canterville. But I don't know what the words mean."
"They mean," he said sadly, "that you must weep for me, because I have no tears, and pray with me, because I have no faith, and then the angel of death will have mercy on me. You will see fearful shapes in darkness, and wicked voices will whisper in your ear, but they will not harm you, for against the purity of a little child the powers of hell cannot prevail."
"I am not afraid." She suddenly stood up and said firmly, "I will ask the angel of death to have mercy on you." He rose from his seat with a faint cry of joy and took her hand. Virginia did not falter as he led her across the dusky room. On the faded green tapestry were embroidered little huntsmen. They blew their tasseled horn and they cried, "Go back, little Virginia, go back." But the ghost clutched her hand more tightly. Horrible animals with lizard tails blinked at her from the carved chimney-piece and murmured, "Beware, little Virginia, beware." But the ghost glided on more swiftly. When they reached the end of the room, she opened her eyes and saw the wall slowly fading away like a mist, and a great black cavern in front of her. A bitter cold wind swept around them, and she felt something pulling at her dress.
"Quick, quick!"
cried the ghost,
"or it will be too late."
and in a moment the wainscoting had closed behind them, and the tapestry chamber was empty. 3 long days passed without a word or a clue as to Virginia's whereabouts, and the Otis family was in a terrible state of despair. On the evening of the 3rd day, the family sat down to a melancholy meal which no one, not even the twins, felt like eating. Just as they were leaving the dining room, midnight began to boom from the clock tower, and when the last stroke sounded, they heard a crash and a sudden shrill cry. A peal of thunder shook the house. A panel at the top of the staircase flew back with a loud noise, and out on the landing, looking very pale and white, stepped Virginia. In a moment they all rushed up to her. "Good heavens, child, where have you been?" said Mr. Otis, when he had recovered his voice. "Papa," said Virginia quietly, "I have been with the ghost. He is dead, and you must come and see him." Turning round, the girl led her family through the opening in the wall, down a secret corridor. Finally they came to a great oak door, studded with rusty nails.
When Virginia touched it, it swung back on its heavy hinges, and they found themselves in a little low room. Embedded in the wall was a huge iron ring, and chained to it was a skeleton that seemed to be trying to grasp with its long, fleshless fingers an old wooden plate and jug that had been placed just out of its reach. Virginia knelt down beside the skeleton and began to pray silently, while outside the window an old withered almond tree had put forth one white blossom in the moonlight. "God has forgiven him," said Virginia gravely, as a beautiful light seemed to illuminate her face. That's all the time we have for tonight. We hope that you have enjoyed Saturday Night Scares. We will be back next week at 8:30 for another horror story. Join us again if you dare.